Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. As you heard, my name is Rachel, and unfortunately I haven't been with you the whole week. I have a young baby, so I'm just coming in and I'll jet out again. But it's good to be here, and I had the privilege with Josh to present something about socio-economic characteristics of ASM in Malawi. So I'm currently a researcher, as you heard, with the Tax Justice Network, but I've been working in Malawi's extractive industries for the last 6 years, partly with government, partly with civil society, partly as an independent consultant. I sat on Malawi's first EITI multi-stakeholder group, and I also run a website called Mining in Malawi, where you can get a lot of news about Malawi's mining sector.
Okay. I'll just introduce myself at the start. So I'm Josh, and as John mentioned, I'm a doctoral researcher from Royal Holloway, University of London. My previous research has been based in Ghana, but currently I am living and researching in Malawi. Also, I'm a student of Gavin Hilson, so I've just been absorbing knowledge from him for about 4 years now, and hopefully I'm looking to learn a lot more about the country here as well.
Great, and just we're going to be going through 3 different sections. I'll take the first 2 and then hand over to Josh. So to start off with, we'll be looking at who is involved in Malawi's small-scale mining sector, and then we'll move on to discussing what happens across the mining life cycle, so the starting of mining and then actually sale of stones. And then I'm going to hand over to Josh, who's going to dig a little bit deeper into some key issues, into some of the buzzwords, formalization, what makes a miner motivated to mine in the first place, and access to finance. Just to say, as I start, we think there are about 40,000 people working in Malawi's small-scale mining sector. However, as you know from your own countries, these numbers are to be treated with a bit of caution. This number is from a 2001 study that was done on the SADC region, and even then it was an estimate. So we can expect that this number is probably an underestimate of the number of people working in Malawi's small-scale mining sector today, especially with the rise of a couple of rush mining sites. And also worth mentioning, sometimes people talk about the World Bank's employment multiplier, so that for every 1 person directly involved in the small-scale mining sector, 6 other people have some form of employment. So this number, we can put it up there, but as you know, it's just to be taken with a little bit of pinch of salt. And this is generally the case. There's been very little research done on Malawi's small-scale mining sector. Under GMAP, there's been an inventory of formal small-scale mine sites, but there's a lot of people also operating without licenses, which is why I actually asked Josh if he would be willing to join this presentation, because he's one of the few people who have been doing academic research on Malawi's small-scale mining sector. So a lot of what I'm going to say today is based on the limited literature, on some grey literature that NGOs and civil society have published, some things that government have published, as well as a lot of anecdotes that we get in the newspapers and the media. So I'm going to try and avoid generalization as much as I can, but obviously I'm going to be ending up generalizing, which doesn't do honor to all the miners in the country, but let's just say work is needed and work is in progress around improving what we know. So obviously there's the debate around informal and formal mining. Obviously in Malawi there's both informal and formal mining taking place. Most of the mining is unlicensed, even though licenses in the country are cheaper than those in the region. Miners complain that it takes a long time for their permits to be processed, which means that they often will start mining without having the requisite licenses. In the country, most of Malawi's gemstones are produced in the small-scale mining sector. The small-scale mining sector also produces a lot of industrial minerals, minerals that go into the agriculture sector and into building. For the small-scale mining sector, at least according to some government reports, gemstones and limestone are the most valuable sectors for small-scale mining, but perhaps there's some more updated figures which we can discuss afterwards. So, those of you who are not from Malawi may not know that the majority of us are farmers, subsistence farmers. Most are living in rural areas. So, but what we've seen is there's been some seasonal and periodic small-scale mining that takes place to supplement farm income. small-scale mining is it provides the greatest source of income from non-farm income sources. So charcoal burning, firewood selling, like piecework, ganyu labor, they all don't generate as much as small-scale mining does to farmers. So you see that there are some miners who are fully dependent now on mining, and these are generally the mine owners, but laborers in mines generally are also still subsistence farmers. So one of Malawi's researchers who's done research on small-scale mining sector is Dr. Paul Kamlongera, and he's written a couple of published articles on this. And this quote is from some research he did in the early 2000s. So there's been blue agate mining in a village in Chikwawa, which is in the south of the country. And so he was speaking to farmers and those also involved in small-scale mining. So I'm just going to read this, and you can read along with me. For most people, farming had been the only source of both subsistence and disposable income. Apart from its failures to cater for the livelihoods due to poor harvests, the long wait does not help, as it takes a year to realize the benefits. Sometimes you do not even get what you hope for because of poor harvest or bad selling prices for crops. Turning to mining, as long as you have mined something, one is assured of ready income, which can keep you going day by day. So I'm sure in many of the other countries represented in the room, that mining, small-scale mining, is often a supplement for a main source of income, such as agriculture, particularly in this region. So there's also linkages between the farming and mining sector, of course. So people that are involved in mining as well as farming will often use the sales from their stones to buy inputs for farming, as well as to pay for other necessities such as school fees, school uniform, etc. So it's a bit difficult to find out how much laborers are getting in the sector, but we think it's about $1 a day, which is about 1,000 kwacha, but they may also be getting meals, lodging, and even bonuses when they do a great job. At rush sites, it's a bit different, and this is only anecdotal evidence from what journalists have collected, so it is open to dispute. But people that are currently at some of the gold rush mining sites say that every 3 days they're getting between 150 to $300 US. So 100,000 to 200,000 kwacha for those of us who work in kwacha. They say that when luck strikes, they may get up to 1 million kwacha, which is about 1,500 US. So moving on to what happens along the mine cycle. So acquiring a license is generally quite difficult for small-scale miners to do business legally. This is partly because of perhaps delays in licensing, even as I said that licenses tend to be cheaper. And most small-scale miners are not tax compliant. They're not paying income sales tax, employment tax. This is partly because there's a lack of information perhaps around what taxes should be paid. There's also costs in complying. There's maybe not an incentive to comply. On the other hand, there isn't such strong enforcement from the government side. Perhaps it's also unrealistic that miners are operating legally because majority of Malawi's economy is informal. So the Institute of Bankers for Malawi recently said that only 25% of people in Malawi have a bank account. But if you look at that figure, it's probably not everyone is actually using their bank account. And then in Malawi's most recent labor survey, 89% of people are in the informal economy, which means that when we're talking about tax compliance, it's realistic that not so many people are complying. Also very interested to hear views afterwards from people from some of the associations and cooperatives from their own experiences, because generally running small and medium-sized enterprises is a challenge, but often artisanal is micro at the micro level. So Josh is going to talk a little bit more about finance and credit later, but just to say most miners in Malawi struggle to get access to formal finance from formal institutions. So a majority of financing is coming from families or from buyers giving money up in advance or from reinvesting money from sales. There have been some efforts for the formal financial sector to provide services to small-scale miners, such as FCH Bank, but my understanding that hasn't progressed to the extent that miners have actually accessed finance. So at the mine site, obviously various tools and equipment are being used, generally diggers, generally picks and shovels. Some people do have access to diggers. There have been a couple of examples of this when a buyer has given money up front in exchange for a commitment of a certain tonnage of perhaps stone, and then miners have gone and rented equipment. Obviously there's risks in that, because if the returns aren't as great as one thought, one could end up in debt. So again, we don't know the numbers, but there are anecdotal and clear indications that there are children working at mines. Just as there are children working on subsistence farms in Malawi, there are also children working in mine sites. The extent of the problem isn't documented, but there are obviously risks for children working at mines. There are a lot of women at the informal mine sites working as laborers. So at the gold mining sites, at one site, 3 women passed away in the last year. And periodically you hear of deaths at informal sites, especially along riverbeds when mine shafts collapse. And the experience for women in the mining sector, there's been one study by UN Women on the impact of extractives on women, both in the large scale and the small scale mining sector. So in some ways it's comparable to the experience of women in other sectors. There's a problem of violence. There's a problem of STDs transmitting, and there's also anecdotes as well as evidence suggesting that high alcohol abuse amongst perhaps miners or communities where mines are happening affects women and children adversely. But again, a lot of anecdotal evidence, not so much robust evidence, but still important to discuss, and I think this is probably a challenge we share across the continent. So again, environmental issues. There is obviously acute at rush mining sites. Governments often not in the position to support to the extent that's needed, especially Environmental Affairs Department. If the government was to introduce additional requirements, environmental requirements, health and safety requirements, this actually might be prohibitive for small-scale miners because they don't have enough capital or access to buy the necessary equipment. But not to say that, but still there needs to be some sort of improvement to the way the environment and laborers are taken care of. Perhaps a contentious issue is around the use of mercury, because we have a couple of rush gold sites, but as far as we know, there's no documented use of mercury. However, from other examples in the continent, we know that even if the miners themselves cannot access or purchase mercury, buyers will often supply mercury to the miners themselves, and we have buyers from across the region, from Tanzania and Mozambique and further afield. So there is a chance that we have mercury being used in production, and it's also worth looking at whether cyanidation is being used as well in this process. So after mining, so Cam Longera, as I mentioned, was one of the researchers that's done some work on the small-scale mining sector. He describes, along with Gavin Hilson, he was a student of Gavin Hilson, that there are predatory middlemen who really try and pay low prices and exploit miners. We know this as well from our agriculture sector, but I think it's probably more difficult in the small-scale mining sector because there is no marketing facilities for people working out selling stones. There's often reliance on a single buyer who obviously then can set the price. So a lot of miners are price takers and not price setters. And we've talked, and I think there'll be a whole presentation around cooperatives and the ability that cooperatives have to improve access to markets. We don't have that many small-scale mining cooperatives, although the government is working towards that. But we also need to question the effectiveness of the cooperatives, because is it actually improving the prices? Is it improving access to market? Because it may not actually be doing that if miners are actually operating individually, but just in name in a cooperative. And we have lessons we can learn from farming cooperatives in the country and from cooperatives in your country. So generally there's limited value addition. This is improving slowly with government input and government support, but there's a lot more work to be done in this front. And so, yeah, suffice to say, I think we have probably from the Gemstones Association of Malawi, from Mawima, and from Zimba Gemstone Cooperative would all probably have their own stories about how they're able to add value and the difficulties they face. And finally, smuggling is also an issue. Obviously, because smuggling is hidden, we do not know the extent to which it's happening. We can safely assume it is happening. There's lots of anecdotal evidence of stones being smuggled in the region, also Malawi being used as a conduit country. And I thought I'd end my section with this slide, just to talk about the overlap between sort of illicitness. So this ivory was found last year in Thailand, in Bangkok. It was seized and it had come through Malawi. Malawi has been a hub for the trafficking of wildlife products. We've just got a new legislation that makes it much more difficult for people who are caught, so we're hoping that this will be reduced. But this was found in Bangkok, and if you can see in between the stones there is some rose quartz. Amongst the ivory, you can see some rose quartz, and this was smuggled out of Malawi as rose quartz. So I'm just putting it out there because we don't really know much about what's going on in the illegal sector around smuggling, but this is an example clearly of where the mining sector has some links with other criminal sectors. So I'm going to hand now over to Josh, but as a segue, we're going to watch a little video that was produced by a media house looking at the gold rush mining site that's taking place 25 kilometers from here, south of the Longway. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Rachel, for that, for covering, I guess, such a broad range of issues, some of them which have kind of already come up during this workshop, but bringing them together so succinctly and now allowing me the opportunity to delve a little bit deeper into maybe a couple of the more debated areas. I think these debates are applicable to Malawi as well as other countries, so hopefully there's something that we can take away from this. And that's, I'm hoping to address the challenge that Cassius stated in the opening of this workshop, that we need to be thinking, we need to be challenging our thoughts. So this might be a little bit more conceptual, but I hope it can relate to some of the challenges and some of the questions that you've already had. So first, as Rachel said, I'll look through some issues about maybe understandings of formality and informality, and then go on to these motivations that miners have and other stakeholders have, and then finish on kind of covering some thoughts I have on finance briefly that have come from my own research. So, would someone be able to just click on the laptop down there to get to the next, just somewhere off the video? I'm not too sure. Sorry about this. I'll just keep talking while the technical issues are resolved. So one of the key issues I see arising from the video, and also many discussions that we have on ASM and also discussions that we've had here at this workshop, is what's the difference between illegality and informality. The video highlights how these activities are illegal, but are they better described as informal? I guess there's questions about what is the difference. And an important question, and this is an important question that JALF raised, I think on the first day, and kind of stated the complexity of this issue, and it's something that I hope to build on, because I know Ignatius yesterday provided a definition as well that I've kind of been working with and thinking about. So the definition used by the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals and Sustainable Development, which is a bit long-winded, so from now on let's use IGF, and it's also one of the funders of this workshop. This definition stems from earlier research, largely from academia, but is now kind of being brought into policy spheres. So it states that informal ASM are operations that do not have the requisite licenses and permits required by law, but through social and cultural norms, rules and practices that have developed over many decades have a social license to operate from local community, or other local actors who do not have the power or authority vested by the state to award mineral rights, concessions and permissions to mine. So what we see here is informality being defined through its illegality, not confining to the law, and also its legitimacy, something that is getting from society. It's achieving this through societal norms, values and beliefs. So what society deems as socially acceptable or societally acceptable. So what we have is something that is illegal but legitimate. So even though it is illegal, it's socially accepted. Activities that are illegal and socially acceptable fall into the criminal economy or the renegade economy. For example, most people will agree that slave labor is socially acceptable and should be captured within this criminal realm, this renegade realm. It's not informal. It's something worse than that. However, this thinking is commonly applied, now commonly applied to informal activities. Formal definitions fail to capture this, this understanding of societal acceptance. Instead, you get definitions like this that focus on legality alone. So, again, from the IGF, so formal ASM would be operations that have the requisite licenses and permits required by the law and conform to regulation, policy, and management practices. I think that kind of aligns with our thinking that we've been discussing throughout this workshop. So legality is the main topic here, and it's what we talk about usually when we cover formalization, especially in like policy domains. So looking at getting miners to meet all the legal, all the regulatory conditions and frameworks. There's no reflection of the societal acceptance here. Yet when we consider how large-scale mining companies have globally faced countless of challenges dealing with societal acceptance of communities in which they operate in, to me it feels like actually this is quite an important thing. There's often this demand from governments as well that as a condition to mine, we need to think about communities, especially for these large-scale mines, and I'm sure it's now kind of what I've heard from the discussions here, that actually it's becoming more and more important for small-scale mining as well. There was the community uprising in Mangochi recently that had the power to close these illegal operations that by some may have been viewed more as informal. And so these communities as well, like, they may not close them down, but there's also costs from delay, obstruction. There could be costs relating to like the marketing of these minerals. And so I'm kind of bringing this, what I see, there's this big debate on CSR and large scale, and kind of bringing it down into the small scale. So I'd say that who here, I guess it's a question, who here that is engaged in mining, that is seeking to formalize their activities, has had to deal with, I guess, some of the pressures that communities bring or that they've had to work with. So it's something maybe worth thinking about, whether you are actually having to engage with the communities and what that means for formality. So instead of just seeing formal operations as something that are legal, I challenge that and say that actually we need to consider formal operations as something that are legal and also legitimate. If you don't have this legitimacy, the societal acceptance from communities, then you'd move into this other classification, the anti-social economy, something that is legal but illegitimate. And this anti-social economy is going to come with extra costs, extra burdens. It's these costs that I was talking about that come from the communities, potentially delays, bad PR. And while this is now currently being viewed more on the large scale, I think as ASM develops, and if it is to formalize, these issues may get more involved and may become more visible. And you may have already experienced themselves, although it's not been discussed about too much as far as I've read in the literature. So why is this important? Because as we saw from Rachel's discussion, ASM is about people. It's about miners, diggers, financiers, men, women, children. It's about mining communities, and it's about these wider populations. It's about benefiting society as well as the economy. If formalization is to be a success, and it fails to consider the wider mining community and also the wider population, who I think should benefit, and maybe most of us would agree should benefit from these resources, there's going to be conflict, and there's going to be these range of costs that I've already mentioned. However, what is socially accepted changes over time, and also across space, which makes this framework a little bit more confusing. What one community believes is acceptable, another community may believe is not. And while this does add confusion, I think the main point is that we just have to carefully consider ASM's legitimacy before we risk demonizing certain components, or what some people may consider illegitimate, and glorifying others, such as the legal component, which actually some people may question and not see the benefits of. There was recently a large conference in Livingston, ASM 18, that brought together 500 stakeholders. I recognize some faces now who are in this room. One of the takeaway messages that got mentioned again and again is that this is about the voices of ASM. And I think these voices of ASM, it needs to include the wider community, it needs to include society. And moving to formalization is going to be this transition, a process, rather than an action. And that transition requires paying attention to legislative and regulatory requirements, as well as societal norms, values, and beliefs. This legitimacy if you want conflict to be avoided. And And while this framework is far from perfect, and with any definition, especially if I'm trying to be precise, there's also this exclusion. However, I hope this helps to extend our current thinking about informality and formality. So this is something I'm currently working on. So, going back to this thought of formalization as a process. So, nothing in real life is as clear-cut as definitions that I've kind of just mentioned. There's no just step from informality to formality. It's this transition. It takes time, and that's not only for miners, it's also for governments. I think that's something that's John's brought up here as well, that not everything is going to happen at once. You can't expect everything to happen at once. For almost all ASM operations, it's going to be unfeasible to meet every single legal and regulatory burden straight away. You're going to have these extremes. So rather, there's this spectrum of formality and informality that you must move along. So as noted by McQuilkin and Hilson, it ranges from the most rudimentary and unlicensed and informal operations up to those with best practice that are licensed and formalized. And moving along this spectrum should offer better societal, economic, and environmental outcomes, but requires assistance. And many of the questions at this workshop have come from individuals who are looking to move along this spectrum, or that's what I've been hearing. But to achieve this, then there needs to be help. And there's clearly demand from assistance from government, as we've heard many times, but also other institutions and stakeholders, such as those supporting this PanAfGeo workshop or initiative. And it sounds like there's a lot of train the trainers in the room, so I think that many of you here will also be turned to help miners as well. This support has to target the range of stakeholders. And so we can't be exclusionary just by focusing on one element of this. We need to be ready to meet a range of people who need a range of training. I think something that John brought up in relation to value addition. There's this range of people with range of skills. And right now, there's only this capacity to help maybe some, but actually we need to think a bit broader. What does everyone need? How can we help everyone? Not everyone's going to be ready for this type of assistance just yet. It's going to be this process, this transition. So typically, I guess, on one end, we're going to have these poverty-driven miners, maybe that are unlicensed, the most informal. And at the other end, we're going to have these investment-driven miners. And these are the kind of different motivations that you might find. So I'm going to move on to the motivations now. So miners exist along this, so it's another spectrum here. Nothing's clear-cut. Miners exist along a spectrum of motivations for engaging with the sector. This exists in Malawi and elsewhere, and exists in other sectors, with agriculture as well, for example. At one end, you have people that are opportunistic, that are going to be seeking to rush towards the sector. They're looking to get rich quick, or they're being lured, just pulled to try and make greater economic profits, or greater economic returns. And then at the other end, there's going to be individuals that are pushed by poverty and distress. And I think we saw in the video yesterday, these two extremes highlighted numerous times. Some were pushed by failed businesses, and others, such as the Chinese, were typified as, or perceived as those that just wanted to make money. However, these motivations are often not universal and can change over time. They exist on this spectrum, and they can be diverse, with a combination of poverty and distress pushing individuals into the sector, and also those seeing this as an opportunity to make money. At the same time, looking to build on potentially alternative livelihoods. There can be this mix of push and pull, and someone driven by poverty can initially come to see the sector as an opportunity to gain wealth later on, once they realize its potential. Rachel highlighted the often seasonal nature of mining in Malawi. Farmers may support and supplement their incomes at different times of the year. However, unforeseen changes in circumstances may shift motivations as well. During a year of drought, farmers may turn to the sector as a way out of distress, a way to escape poverty and extreme hunger. At another time, they may already have a viable livelihood from farming, but see ASM as a way to make a greater income. Another example could be something as common as a family sickness, which I think we saw in the video yesterday as well, where this could push individuals toward ASM, and once this sickness is maybe cured or they have enough income to support it, they may now change their behavior, and they could be more opportunistic, seeing the potential to make money, to get greater incomes. But these are quite dry examples, and I'm sure that many people in this room have seen or experienced these range of motivations and have their own stories which are far richer and much more complex than what I've just illustrated now. So this kind of understanding of differing societal acceptance and varying motivations forms the basis of my own research into the financing of ASM. Even though ASM is often viewed as being rudimentary, requiring little capital, it still needs money, even in its most basic forms. And it's often the people that are the most poorest. It might not seem a lot, but actually this can be a lot of money to them. There is this need for capital before and during operations, even after if you're going to have rehabilitation. So these costs, they're going to swell if formalisation is to be achieved, and also if we want to improve these mine sites. If we want to kind of implement all these different health and safety and environmental standards that we've been discussing over the past few days. In the past, financial inclusion has generally been discussed through looking at banks and microfinance initiatives. This has been looked at globally and promoted as necessary to stop the harm that people face when dealing with informal finance. So on one end, you have these, there's this glorification of formal financial means or avenues, and this demonization of informal sources. And this doesn't just go in ASM, where you have these connotations of predatory middlemen and dealers who exploit and abuse the miners, who they do this through their finance. This is discussed in almost all sectors. However, I think this is only one side of the story. Both formal and informal sources can be beneficial or exploitative. They can be harmful as well as a source for good. Since the 1970s, research has shown that informal finance is often better suited to the needs of informal individuals, of the relatively poor, being more flexible, easier to access, and also having lower relative rates of interest than bank loans. So I think, like formal mining, we also need to think about formal banking, considering these societal acceptabilities and whether it is suited to the client, and in this case, miners. Maybe this stretches out towards other stakeholders as well, not just formal banking, but we can look at other aspects of ASM and other support. Other stakeholders that are supporting the sector, both directly and indirectly. So rather than demonizing financiers that often only provide the only avenue of finance for ASM miners, I think we need to consider more deeply what is their role, and is it beneficial, is it exploitative, rather than just typifying it. We've seen for many years how miners have been grouped into this category of being inherently negative, but actually what we're doing here today is kind of questioning that and seeing there can be these beneficial cases and how can we make it beneficial. And this needs to extend not only from the miners, but also out to other stakeholders. So rather than excluding these actors, these financiers, from formalization debates, they may prove crucial in the meaningful development of the sector. This becomes even more pressing due to this underlying conflict of financing ASM through traditional banks. So I think we've heard this already here, I can't remember who stated it, but mining titles with geological data, which in itself is a rarity, and I'm sure many of you have struggled to get geological data for ASM operations, are often proposed as granting the basis to finance, offering this source of collateral that can overcome these issues that the banks have with lending to this sector. However, there's a difficulty in using mineral reserves as collateral, especially on small scale. Over time, the collateral is literally it's depleted. It's literally mined away. So you have this collateral base, but over time it just disappears. This creates further challenges in overcoming the inherent risks associated with mining, especially for traditional bank loans. And this is a nuance that my supervisor, Professor Gavin Hilson, has found with bank officers in Ghana, where they're very, very wary because they realize this collateral base isn't enough. And while more nuanced approaches may be able to overcome this challenge, especially if you're looking at avenues of trying to collect social capital, and there's other challenges related to this lack of information that banks have on the ASM sector that lead it to perceive it as being inherently too high risk. There are these other avenues of finance available that are able to overcome these risks, although they are informal. Instead of persecuting these actors, I would say that actually we need to learn from them. There might be important lessons, not just from the actors themselves, but also the clients. the wider ASM community that are having to deal with this, especially in the design and implementation of sustainable financing mechanisms, which I'm sure everyone here would like to see at some point in the future, but they just don't exist. My background has been based on microfinance. The reason I'm looking at this is because the more I research microfinance, the less I thought it actually could work for this sector. We need to understand it more. We need to look at what's already there, how these sustainable financial mechanisms are working, even though they are informal. And looking at the range of actors that are engaged with ASM directly and indirectly that can help further the sector's meaningful development. So I've got a lot more that I could probably say on finance, but I'll leave it there for now because I'm kind of looking to hear in the future the voices of everyone here, what you think. And I think Rachel is going to quickly tie up this presentation.